You should be okay now.
We're good. All right, that's good. All right, it's 7:01. So, and I'd like to call to order this June 21st meeting of the Board of Ed Strategic Planning Committee. And we have a very short agenda this evening. We're going to, if we recall some of the goals that we had set forward 2 weeks, well, 4 weeks ago. And tonight, was about capacity and the feeder patterns. And so tonight we're going to talk about the operational capacity at both the middle schools.
All right, so maybe I'll just take the lead for a second. So you did say it's short agenda. However, looking at some of our guests, I don't think our agendas are always that short. But nonetheless, one of our strategies that we discussed was to review the enrollment projections. And I believe Cheryl Cook did send out to everyone Malone and McBroom's projections from this past year, November 2020. And what you'll see is there's a high projection, a medium projection, and a low projection. And one of the strategies that we looked at was to review the enrollment projections and really identify when the learning experience shifts based on what our principals can share about operationally, what our schools look like and feel like once we hit a particular number. And it's not an exact science, which Principal Salem and Principal Ranieri will share. However, there is some information that I think we can utilize to determine where we need to go from here, if we need to go anywhere.
Yep.
And so just for the sake of clarity, and Margaret, perhaps you can share out, I believe for the most part, the Malone and McBroom has recommended that we look at the high projections with the exception of this year. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. So why don't you, Tim, I know that we discussed a couple of points to share out tonight. So maybe you can take the lead here and then we can leave it for the community to ask some questions that could help clarify the question that we're really asking ourselves is, do we need to identify short-term and long-term goals around feeder patterns? What kind of experience do our students have? When does it possibly shift? And what we need to be considering short and long-term?
Sure. So you'll have to forgive me if this feels a little bit like Groundhog's Day, because we had this discussion prior to this current board. So this is not certainly a reflection of the current board nor the current administration, but when this, and John, I think you have the presentation. So if you want to launch that, that would be helpful. But while John is doing that, I'd just like to start by articulating that initially the 50-50 split, for people that have that historic understanding and remembrance, it was supposed to be a one-year fix for a very tough budget season. However, we knew going into that decision, it would be really difficult to sell something like that for 1 year. You're making these, what I thought from a parent perspective, really nice changes in terms of it's a lot cleaner. You're having 3 elementary schools, Scotland, Barlow, and Ridgebury go to one middle school and the other 3 go to the other. Instead of, prior to that, as you may recall, Scotland was a 50-50 split, and then Barlow was about a 70-30 split. And so, I get that. It's hard. You have kids breaking up friendships, and that's the way it was for a long period of time to really meet that 60% student body at East Ridge versus that 40% capacity at Scotts Ridge. And so while the 50-50 was certainly clean, and makes sense from a parent perspective and from a community perspective, what the question that I was asking way back then was, after this current year, if we're looking at the years after that, what is that going to look like for capacity? And so here we are at this very meeting. So John, could you put the first slide up? I think I just gave sort of a shorter version of this first slide. So right, so anybody who knows a little bit about how the middle schools were designed knows that when CERMS was built, it was built to hold approximately 40% of the students, while East Ridge would retain 60%. And that happened to do with, back then, the growing numbers at that particular time. And then in 2016, Malone and McBroom, as you know, there were declining numbers. And then, is Tricia on this? Is Tricia here? I know Tricia found the next bullet when we went back through our notes and preparing for this conversation. Tricia had went back into her notes and found some information regarding that particular budget season and how that 50-50 split sort of helped to meet the needs of that budget. Tricia,
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct, Tim. So at that point, the superintendent at the time was facing a cap on the budget of 2.5%. And so looking at this declining enrollment was a way to meet that fiscal requirement.
Thank you. I thought, I remember.
And you and I were both like, oh, this is according to Malone and McBroom, we're going to be facing this again in the future. And
Right.
as you said, here we are.
Yep. So in any event, I had at that time suggested a different idea, but it didn't fly. So in any event, we ended up with the 50-50 split between the three elementary schools, and that resulted in some redistricting between Scotland and Barlow, which essentially sent all of Barlow and Scotland students to Scotts Ridge. So that just gives you a little bit of the background. Does anybody have any questions regarding just the background piece of this? I just don't want to move too fast if people are have any questions that we might be able to answer. If
Just,
not, we can.
just one thing, just to maybe for the sake of the newer board members or people in the public who are listening, the reason that there was a savings at that time was because we were able to reduce a team at East Ridge over the next 3 years. Is that correct?
Yes,
that is.
it would be a team each year.
Yeah.
So it was 12 positions over 3 years, plus a little bit more because Unified Arts also declined, not just the teams. And I'm not sure, Karen Dewing can probably tell us the total FTE reduction, but it was 12 core teachers because it was 3 full teams, 1 each year for 3 years, and then percentages of our specialists.
Thanks. I just want to clarify, just for, again, newer members to understand where those savings came from.
And
Yeah,
just
that's an important point, Margaret. Thank you.
Scott, just for a minute, Tim, in
Sure.
terms of for laymen or folks that are listening in, so when yes, you saved FTE, but then the class size increased at Scotts Ridge.
Right.
So it wasn't, so potentially they knew that they were saving FTE, but they also knew that the class size would increase, obviously at both schools, really, but in particular at Scotts Ridge.
Yes, that's correct.
And Tim, I don't know
Yes.
if this is the proper point in the presentation, but I would be interested in hearing what your idea was.
Well, if you don't mind, Ken, if we could just go through these, and then I have no problem explaining to you at the time what I thought would be, a better idea. And I'll throw it out there and we can see what everybody thinks of it. But in any event, yeah, let's just go through, if you don't mind, Ken. I'll go through the slides and then I'll be happy to share that with you.
I don't know. I just wanted to stick a pin in it because I
appreciate that.
Tim.
All right, John, if we can go. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Kathleen. I don't know if you can see.
Was there any, I'm sure you did look extensively at this. Was there any elementary school that was under enrolled where the redistricting could be facilitated in that manner?
Well, that question actually sort of leads to what my humble suggestion was at the time, which I might as well just say it at this point, and we can, we can talk about it later. But my suggestion at that time, and actually I shouldn't say it was just mine, I thought of it, I brought it to Trish. I said, what do you think about throwing this out to the administration? Because it just seems to make a little bit more sense. What we talked about was perhaps looking a little bit more at those feeder lines at the elementary level and looking to see if perhaps the 2 bigger elementary schools, depending upon where those lines were drawn, could come to Scotts Ridge, and then the other 4 could go to East Ridge, because East Ridge had much more of the capacity to handle that sort of move. And so it was just a suggestion about looking at this maybe a little bit differently in terms of taking a deeper dive into the elementary numbers and seeing, instead of looking at the middle schools to make that drawing point for lines, maybe the best bet would be to look at the elementary schools and do some pocket redistricting. So therefore, the two larger ones could go to Scotts Ridge, and it seemed like when we looked at the math, now this is going back a few years, but when we did the math at the time, it seemed like it would be closer to that 60-40. Does that make sense? I'm sorry.
Totally.
Yeah, so that was the suggestion, but I think because of where we were in the process at that particular point in time, the ship had sort of sailed, so to speak.
So Tim, can I just interject?
Sure.
Yeah, because you're right. We definitely had those conversations. And at that time, the 4 schools to East Ridge and 2 schools to Scotts Ridge did not fit either. That's not the right capacity. My remembrance of what happened at that time was that the last redistricting was elementary, and there was no interest in touching the elementary for that.
Right. That's true. Yeah, because it would have meant some
Touching multiple schools.
Yes, exactly. To do that. Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. All right, John, if you don't mind, yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. So this is just, just some of the challenges that we face, just to throw them out there. And of course, anybody, and I know we had multiple BOE members that walked with us through the building as we were planning for this past school year in terms of, trying to condense those classrooms into the hybrid model. And when you came into the classrooms, and I think some of our board members were surprised that even with the hybrid model of classes of 16 looked big in some of those classrooms. And it's primarily because when you look at our Scotts Ridge classrooms, they're built, it's beautiful. There's built-ins on both sides, but those built-ins cut into the actual size of the space that you can put your desks in. So it cuts down considerably on the number of desks that you can fit into a classroom. And then you combine that with the fact that the smart board is off of the wall, it really makes the space feel a lot smaller, and therefore it's limiting a bit in terms of its capacity. Of course, most of you already know that our auditorium is on the small size. When we have to if we need to conduct a whole school event, we have to do it twice because we can't fit everybody into that space and get everybody at one time. It's impossible to do. And from what I understand, of course, I wasn't here back in 2001 and 2002, but when they were towards the end of the construction and some costs had to be cut, from what I understand, the auditorium and the gymnasium were 2 spaces that sort of had to bear the brunt of those cost-cutting measures. So both of those are a bit smaller than we would like. Obviously, families in Richfield know that our gym is super small. There aren't any stands. So it's not as if you hold an event in there, anybody can come and sit and watch. And so those are 2 spaces that are definitely on the smaller side. And then some of you know, because we did show this to you when you came in, that once we went to that 50-50 split, we had 3 workspaces, 1 on each floor, that we had to ultimately convert from workspaces into actual rooms. And so we really, right now, in terms of our classroom space, are max. We really don't have any other convertible spaces at all. Our cafeteria is another space. When you walk through, I'm sure you saw it's on the smaller side. That threshold of 183 for us is kind of that trigger number. And it's challenging to get, students into the lunchroom and out of the lunchroom in a timely fashion when our numbers are at that 183 or above. And it, not that we haven't done it, we've done it, but it's definitely a challenge. And then of course, that we have the one space, which is our turf field for students. Any questions about
Tim,
any of
can you
them?
just clarify currently how many lunch waves do you have in a typical year, not in a COVID year? How many lunch waves do you have?
Yep. So in a typical year, we would have 3. This year we had 6 because we needed to appropriately space students, obviously. And so they 8 by team, which gave us the ability to space students out appropriately according to all safety protocols. But it didn't, I have to say, with 6 lunch waves, it did, even for our custodial staff and our cafeteria staff, it felt much more manageable for them with those numbers.
Right, but in order to have all of your 6th graders together, 7th graders together, 8th graders together, then you need to, cafeteria needs to hold 100 and, well, each grade level cannot be greater than 183, or it just gets tight, right?
Right, after 183, and this is approximations, right? Because you have to remember it's not an exact science because of the fact that when you factor in leveled math classes and some choice in some of our electives, that throws off some of those numbers. But at 183, so at about 550, that's kind of that, after 550, things can get really tricky at Scotts Ridge in terms of that team structure. And I can explain that in a future slide. But does anybody have any questions about the physical plant at all? I just don't want to move too quickly without being able to answer anybody's questions. Okay, John, if we can go to the next slide. All right, so so this is just a little bit more on the class size issues. So at 183, the average class size is approximately 23. And then on the special side, the specials include art, music, PE, those courses. It's about 26. The leveling of math creates some inequitable class sizes, and they do range from anywhere between 16 and 27, depending on the course. And that's just because it's a matter of which students fit into which course. And so you could have a higher number fitting into one math class versus another, and that may create an offset in terms of the size of that class versus the size of another. Same can be true particularly in music with electives, because students can choose which music class they can take. And sometimes we're at the mercy of the same issue, where we could have an overage in one class versus another, and that might take a teacher away from a prep or a meeting period. So let me just explain this so that sometimes it's not easy to understand. So if a team teacher has to teach an overage off of their grade level, it means that students are not with that team. They're actually with a teacher from a different team. Also, what that means is that particular teacher would be taken away from the ability to meet with their co-teaching partners to discuss what the team model is built on, the ideology that in a given period, our team teachers, math, science, English, social studies, can get together and discuss students on their team across the curricular areas. That's really for us in that model, it's an important, and they talk about social emotional wellness. There are a lot of things that happen during that time period. But if a teacher has to teach an overage, it takes them away from their ability to do that. So that's an important note for people to understand in this context. Any questions about that? Okay. John, I think there may be. Okay, so this was that. We actually tried to answer. This was an exact question. I know that came up. What is enrollment? When does the enrollment impact the student learning experience? And as I said, it's not an exact science, but at about 183, so 183 would be on a grade level, or approximately 550 in the building. That's when it gets to a point where we may have to look at a teacher teaching an overage class so when I first got to Scotts Ridge, I'm sure you're probably sick of hearing this story, but when I first got to Scotts Ridge almost 12 years ago, this was a big issue. We were a lot bigger at that time than we are now when I first started. And there were parents on the Scotts Ridge side of Ridgefield that were very upset because there was a difference in class sizes versus East Ridge and Scotts Ridge. And as a result, we had teachers teaching off team. We actually had to attach a language teacher to a team. So it was creating some really funky practices. And so one of the first things that I learned within that first summer was we needed to make some shifts. And thankfully that board and Debbie Lowe, who was the superintendent at the time, we made some pocket redistricting changes early when I first got to Scotts Ridge that created more equity in terms of class sizes, and then also our ability not to have overages, which was important to keep that team model in place. And so the other piece of it too is, as you know, if you've been to Scotts Ridge, the physical plant itself, unless we're going up, there really isn't a lot of space. If you look behind us, it's the Arboretum out there, it's the cross-country course, it's all wood. There's really not a lot of space to go backwards. So, and we've converted most of our teacher, actually just about every space has been converted. So we're right now, just from a physical standpoint, at our max in terms of what room we have. So I hope that might be helpful to give people some perspective.
Thanks, Tim. So when we look at, just to give additional context, when we look at the enrollment projections, if this year, we were looking at this year, we would be looking at the medium projections, although currently Scotts Ridge, your enrollment's not 517. I think you went up, right, Tim?
Yes, a little bit. I think for next year, we're at 519, I think, if I'm looking correctly.
Okay, so we're pretty close.
Yep.
On the medium projections, if we're looking at that 550 number, which isn't always 550, right? Because it's broken up by school. It doesn't look like we would need to be concerned about going over what would impact the experience at Scotts Ridge, if I'm correct, Tim, right?
Right. Yeah.
Under 550. That doesn't mean that the class sizes aren't going to be inequitable to East Ridge, but ultimately that's the same that happens at the elementary schools.
Right.
You have some,
very true.
Some classes that have a higher number of students in a fifth grade, and some across town that might be lower, or similarly in a kindergarten. That said, if we use the high projections, which is what Malone and McBroom currently or most frequently recommends that we use, if I'm understanding that correctly, in the 24-25 and 25-26 school year, and then again in 29-30 and 30-31, we would be looking at an impact on the experience. And what I'm hearing Tim say is the impact on the experience most significantly, depending upon where those kids could land, would be that some of these classes could be over even 27 students. Is that correct, Tim?
That's correct. Right. Once we cross that threshold, then that's exactly the outcome that we wouldn't want, because then it forces us to look at, if we have a class that breaks, then we have to pull another teacher to teach that overage. And that's when it's not, it sort of takes away from that team model and team structure.
Kathleen?
I'm happy to answer any questions.
I don't have a question, but I'm going to comment on something else that I saw that, of course, is not breaking the 550 rule, but knowing about middle school and those transitional years, and the fact that Ridgefield Public Schools have committed themselves to the team model, I heard two things that were concerning that have to happen. Nevertheless, even if we go up to 550, one of them are the grade level breakout rooms, which allow for differentiated learning, group learning, all the things that are 21st century skills, as well as the teacher breakout rooms where the teachers can work and collab together to create a model. So it seems that's even being compromised without the basic student experience being compromised in terms of larger classes. Am I correct? Did I hear that correctly, Tim?
Well, I'm happy that you're listening for that, Kathleen, because those are really vital and important. But it's not until really we have a class that breaks, that it makes that type of impact. For the most part, we've been able to offset that and accommodate those numbers so that it doesn't affect that team model. And in fact, Karen knows, and she's been wonderful in working with us through really sometimes tricky situations where you might have a 0.2 position or a point, and we're either, in years past, we were able to borrow from the high school to get somebody to come just to keep that team model in place and intact. So right now, we're in a place where we're able to continue operating as like we believe we should be in protecting it. It's just that it does get tricky once we start crossing it over 550.
The other piece is that what happened when the shift from 50-50, 60-40 went to 50-50, is some of those ancillary spaces, Kathleen, are now being used for support services. So for example, the faculty quote unquote workroom, where it wasn't just a copy machine, it was actually a room where folks could prepare their work and prepare their lesson plans, went by the wayside. And that room is now being used alternatively either for a support staff member or a specialist. So that those rooms are actually kind of long gone. If I understand what Tim has shared in the past, shared with me, is that those went as soon as we shifted from 60-40 to 50-50. So the only really way to bring that back, I would imagine, would be to 60-40. And I don't think that's what we're necessarily looking at. But there really isn't an extra space in that building. All of the extra spaces are being used for those alternative or the specialist staff that may be working with small groups as it is. What we don't have really is an additional classroom spaces that could be converted. So you're definitely picking off little pieces of a space that might be empty during a period where someone could teach math, let's just say, that extra math class.
Right. That's Susie, you explained it absolutely correct. And that's when it gets tricky. Like, we'll end up having to find a space for a teacher to teach the extra math class or what have you, because we have converted all of our spaces at this point.
And so, Tim, while it's not perfect with the numbers, I think I'm hearing you say, though, that up until 550, unless there's something drastic with a math course, you can maintain the class sizes at or around 25-ish, right?
Yep.
There might be one here or there, and you wouldn't have to go off team. It's once that number goes above 550. Again, I know that the numbers don't play out perfectly all the time.
Right.
You can look at the elementary to see where that impact could be if it's 6th, 7th, or 8th. But generally speaking, you're okay.
That's correct. The only time that would happen absent of being under, if we're under, is if math, it would only be for math. And we have had situations where we've had to pull somebody in, and Tricia had to do the same thing at Eastridge, where we have to have either our math specialist or somebody teach an extra class. But that would be, that's only when those numbers get a little bit out of whack.
Right, but theoretically, that could even happen.
That's what I mean. Yes.
Happen regardless. But the other piece that, Tim, you touched on very briefly, because that could happen at Trisha's school. In fact, happened.
It has
happened this past year or the year before.
Yep.
But the other piece that I think is important to remember with Scotts Ridge that you touched on briefly is the way in which the classrooms were designed, because they were never designed to have 50% of the population. They were designed to have 40% of the population.
Right.
Is that once you get to that 27 mark, let's just say, even if class size wasn't a variable or the impact of class size, you actually can't physically put the children in the space comfortably. So for those that looked, even with the half of our kids in the cohort model, it felt tight. Once all of your kids are in there and with small little desks, never mind tables or anything like that, it feels uncomfortably tight. And I think that's the other piece that we just have to keep in mind. It's not just the number of kids. Even if you had the capacity for the number of kids, you could go up to 29 or 30 kids. You actually can't fit them in a physical space.
That's a really good point. I did touch on that. But again, going back to when you go to Scotts Ridge, it's a beautiful place, and they built these beautiful built-ins along the sides of the classrooms. But when they did that, it does limit your physical space that you can fit desks in those rooms, as some of you saw when you came in to look at how we were setting up the cohorts. And at that time, don't forget, when you came in to observe, we had taken out we had taken out most of any other ancillary desks or were out of the rooms at that point. We had moved, so small group instructional tables were gone. So, that was with that space completely empty other than those student desks and maybe just the teacher's desk.
Tim, just practically speaking, in your auditorium, what's the actual capacity? Like, how many children could you actually put in that space?
333 is the number that you max out at, and that's why
you can have a full grade level in there. You can't have your full school.
No, we usually will. So when we do any kind of presentation, it's usually we'll do the 6th grade teams and 1 7th grade team, and then we'll do 1 7th grade team and 2 8th grade teams for the second one. So we have to do them in 2 waves, create a special schedule. But, we have that down to a science. We've been doing that for a long time. That's not new. But Margaret has a question, I think. Oh, Margaret, you're muted.
You're muted, Margaret.
Sorry. Thank you for what, but I have heard you say this for many years, Tim, and stuff, and I apologize. It does feel like Groundhog Day and stuff. And I absolutely agree that I think when the solutions were come to, it wasn't meant to be a long-term solution. And I'm not surprised that we're back here talking about it, but I am encouraged that we're back here talking about it so that hopefully we can fix it.
Yeah. Yes.
Couple of questions or thoughts or comments. One thing is, as I look at the enrollment projection report, actually what's concerning to me there is we're talking 50-50 here, but it's actually, as I look at that enrollment, that's not even 50-50. It's almost 60-40 the other way, the way that we don't want it, right? Where Scotts Ridge actually has more than East Ridge. So that is certainly concerning, just objectively looking without even knowing what the background is. So it does feel like something has flipped that way, and somehow we've got to address just physically the fact that now Scotts Ridge will have more students than East Ridge. So again, I'm sure there are a couple of different ways to kind of address that. The other thing that we're talking about though is, from a staffing standpoint, what point do we need overages in order to be able to keep the team model and to avoid actually having overages? I wonder though, my question, and I guess I just don't have enough of an understanding is there a sense though, is it kind of like whack-a-mole though? If you move some kids over to East Ridge, now that we've reduced the number of teams, so we have less teams overall. We've got 4 teams as opposed to 5. So if we move kids over, is it just moving some of that concern about class size and overages over now to being at the different school? Can someone walk me through that a little bit?
So Tim, you can probably do this better than I can, but Margaret, it's funny that you bring up the East Ridge, the 60-40 perhaps being now swapped, right? Where you have Scotts Ridge at 60. And the biggest difference between them is that East Ridge, in theory, has space for 60%, where Scotts Ridge had space for 40%. Now it's reversed, but it's not just the redistricting. It's the cost of increasing however many teams, right? Because ultimately, otherwise, it's just a matter of which school you're going to have the higher class sizes with. So
yes,
back to my analogy of the elementary school, there are some elementary schools that have 25 kids in a class, and across town, there may be some that have 20. And then the following year, it may be reversed, and et cetera, et cetera. And it could be that way across the 6 schools. It's not really different here. So unless you're going to increase the number of teams back at East Ridge, so therefore you're decreasing the class size at East Ridge, and subsequently, if you're moving kids over from Scotts Ridge, you're decreasing the class size there. But it's not just about impacting students who are expecting now to go to Scotts Ridge, who would then be shifted back to East Ridge, but then you're going back down the road of increasing a team or teams up, when in fact, based on the number of students, at least for a number of years, you could sustain the model that you have. You could sustain, it's just a matter of where you want to swap it, at least the way I'm seeing it. Go ahead, Tim. I apologize.
No, Susie, you said exactly what I was going to say. Yes, does East Ridge have some open classrooms, yes, but it's irrelevant because, as Susie just indicated, unless you're willing to, if you're moving numbers, you have to add staff. So
I think a key difference I see, Dr. De Silva, to that point is at Scotts Ridge, those 27 kids are going to be sitting on top of each other, where in East Ridge, they're not. So we're still going to have the same number of students. Perhaps they won't. I mean, if the classrooms themselves are bigger, if there are more classrooms, I think the number of teachers is going to stay the same no matter where they're at.
The classrooms are slightly bigger at East Ridge. We measured them.
They did, yeah.
We measured them in this environment. So
makes
slightly
sense.
bigger. But ultimately, the number of classrooms that you have, unless you add teachers,
Mhm.
isn't going to matter because you're
Right.
still going to put the same 27 kids in a class. If you got to 27,
Exactly.
at 550, you're
Yep.
still at 25-ish. But if you're going to go down the road of increasing staff and decreasing class size, then you have the option to do that at East Ridge, where you don't have the option to do that at Scotts Ridge. But ultimately, if you move kids from Scotts Ridge to East Ridge, just the class size is going to be there versus at SERMS. That's the
Right. Well, that's almost like it's almost like two different challenges that we have to figure out a solution to.
if you're looking to solve, there's almost, I think, maybe three.
Right.
You have, are you concerned with the class size? That's one.
Yep.
If you are, at 25, I personally am not concerned. That's what we have in our fifth grades. I'm not concerned of 25. Am I concerned that East Ridge might have class sizes of 22 when SERMS has 25? Perhaps, but there's all, if we're going to, fair isn't always equal. Scotts Ridge has a brand new building. East Ridge has not such a nice building, right? It could be the same at the elementary school. So that, I think, and it could change from year to year, certainly, and across, at least in the math program. So that's one issue. Then the second issue is, if you do want to, which feeds into the 550, if you do want to ensure that you're going back to a 60-40 model or just moving some of the kids over, then you have to navigate the issue of feeder schools and what that means for kids, what that means for families, what that means for when I moved here, I thought. And then the third issue, which has a financial impact, is if you're just going to shift them over to East Ridge, fine. That's just, you're dealing with the other two. But if you're going to do more than shift them over to East Ridge, then you're thinking about, if they were trying to cap their budget at 2.5%, however many years ago, then you're thinking about how many staff members are part of a team, 3 to 4 in a particular year. And so you're looking at the impact of 3 to 4 staff members at least, right?
Can I ask, and this might be too difficult to figure out, but at what point do we go from where 4 teams across the two middle schools, regardless of where the kids actually are, the 4 teams, at what point, number of kids do we need to then know that we definitely have to have 5 teams? Again, wherever they are.
Remember, there's 6 teams, right, at both middle schools. There's 2 per grade level.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Sorry.
That's okay.
So to be able to add, though.
Yeah, you would have to add to 3 in every grade level. Like, when would you know that is the question, right, Margaret?
Yeah. Is there a number? I don't even know that there's a way to figure that out, but we were able to go down. Now, what is it to go back up? Like, what does that increasing enrollment look like?
Well, that would be, I think the best way, Karen, I could see she'd be the best person to answer that because she was a big piece of the subtraction component. So I'm sure she probably would have a better answer than I would.
Well, in theory, it's 200 because you want classes of 25 as our max. So 4 times 25 would be 100 for each team. 2 teams on each level is 200. So if our enrollment's over 200, not by 1, but substantially, is where you would say you'd break again to have 3 teams on that level. So when total enrollment at the elementary school became that if we took kids from East Ridge to Scotts Ridge and had them drop below that, is how we could drop that team. So conversely, the opposite is true.
I have Oh, I'm sorry, Kathleen.
So what I'm hearing is with two teams per grade at this point, and I'm looking at the numbers, none of them look like they're going over 200 yet. Is that optimal? And what is, and now I'm looking at, what weighing, and here we're playing Solomon. Is it better to keep the 3 schools and the other 3 schools together, or do we use a scalpel and carve out where we can move not a non-significant amount, but a significant amount to equalize at least the 2 schools moving forward? And that's basically what I'm hearing, unless I'm mishearing what's being said.
So can I just speak? Because Tim did allude to it, that at one point we did a small redistricting. So it was just a couple of streets to move some kids from Scotts Ridge to East Ridge years ago to reduce that kind of impact on Scotts Ridge, where you don't need many, but just a few students can make a big difference. Is that accurate, Tim?
Yeah, that's what we did back in 2010.
Mhm.
We just did some pocket redistricting, and at that we had a different problem then, though. If you remember, the problem then was at that particular juncture, the class sizes were the big difference. Class sizes at Scotts Ridge were averaging between 24 and 26, 27, and at East Ridge they were more at 21, 22. So we did the pocket redistricting at that time to create more equity between those class sizes. So a little bit of a different issue then,
Right.
but very
'Cause
helpful.
Right, because they still had 3 teams.
They had 3 teams, correct?
Yep.
So that's why their numbers though were lower, because they had 3 teams. They were just spread further apart.
Exactly right.
Yes.
So if that slice, the pocket redistricting is one option, then potentially another option could be, I think what Tim mentioned earlier before, or perhaps it doesn't. Karen, you mentioned it, alluded that it didn't work out before, where we have 2 elementary schools feeding into Scotts Ridge and the 4 into the other. But that's
It didn't with the numbers of each school, but what has never really been discussed is the redistricting of elementary.
right. That's what I mean.
Yeah, but no, not
the
just
whole-
4 to 2,
Yeah.
keeping it as is, but then actually redistricting elementary has never been touched.
Yeah, I think, Margaret, that was the sticky point, was you'd have to then take the conversation away at that particular time in 2016, away from, the redistricting at the feeder from elementary to middle. And were we ready at that point to have that conversation about elementary? I just don't think there was an appetite for it at that time.
Right. So can I ask that question now of the administration? Like separate out the fact that we're talking about this in a middle school context right now. Is there an app? Does it make sense for us to even consider from an elementary standpoint to be redistricting elementary?
Here's what I'm actually going back to a number that Karen brought up that's a little bit different than your number, Tim. Karen brought up that magic number of 200, right? You take the 200 again. What's tricky for Tim, and I understand it, is that it doesn't always work out perfectly because some kids go into a higher level math, and so it's not exactly even. But what are we looking to solve for? Are we looking to solve for balanced numbers of students at East Ridge and Scotts Ridge? If that's what we're looking to solve for, then Margaret, your question is a good one. If we're looking to solve for no more than blank number of students in a particular class, even at the high projection mark right now, I know Tim's numbers are a little bit less, again, thinking about the variability within math classes, but we're not there at all at 200 until.
So don't misinterpret, Susie. So that was the superintendent's decision at looking at reducing a team. It did not take into consideration Tim and the leveled math classes and all the other actual variables that involved in scheduling that is involved in a building. It truly was a budgetary magic number. Here's the cutoff and go down. So I don't want to minimize Tim's 183 because that's the reality of a building.
Right. So 183, practically speaking, if you're dividing kids in math, you could end up if you went to the 200 mark is what I'm saying, you could end up with 27 or 28 kids. If
Mhm.
we're looking at that 200 number and dividing those kids evenly, then you're about 25. At Trisha's school though, naturally you're 20 kids left. So it might be 20 kids less, let's just say in 20, 30, 31. So you may be at 23 or 24 kids in a class. So if we're, I guess ultimately the question is, we're trying to avoid getting to 27, if that in any class, or are we trying to equalize the two schools? And is that a consistent moving target? Is that going to be every 10 years? We're looking at our numbers and saying, oh gosh, 20 kids moved into this neighborhood and 10 kids moved out. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
Well, so I had a couple of comments on that question directly. I think we should adopt some type of process where this is looked at relatively regularly. I mean, I know it's not uncommon for districts to say every 3 years or every 5 years, we're going to redistrict. That's an expectation that we set for parents, for administration, for the board, for the town. This is what's going to happen, and we have to set criteria. I mean, I know there's a lot that goes into that decision, but if we set that expectation up, I think it sort of avoids difficult conversations, because we're going to have it. Or it doesn't avoid the conversation, but it makes it less difficult because we know the expectation is there to have it. The other thing, sort of and I'm obviously super new to this discussion, is it seems like there were some decisions that were made to help a particular budget year or to accomplish a very finite goal that have ended up impacting and negatively 5-10 years down the line. And so any decisions or any discussions that we have around solving these problems, I want to make sure that we're keeping that holistic view in mind, so that we're not going to be causing problems for the district 5 years down the road. Whether it was you making spaces smaller because we needed, another couple $100,000 in our building budget, to, cutting a team and sort of forcing, the feeder pattern to go a certain way so that we could save, a few dollars on a particular year, and is now, and even if we just take out the dollar cost, what is it costing on a social emotional level, not only for our students, but for our teachers. And so, when we're having these discussions, I hope we can approach it a little more holistically than has happened at some sort of finite times in the past. So if we can, we should just all keep that in mind. Just more of a anything.
Yeah, Ken, this is Liz. I agree with you. I love the idea of setting up a process and framework for this, so that future boards don't have to start from scratch again. And the administration also knows, and you guys aren't constantly pulling different data and all of that. I think one of the key questions that Susie asked earlier was a really good one of, what are we trying to do with class sizes? We have some policies around maximum class sizes. Are those still valid? Do we need to go back and suggest that we review those? I mean, what is, because if we're having different class sizes across the middle schools, if they're materially different, how do we define that? And that should be a trigger, I think, for redistricting, even at the elementary level, right? So I do think that there is some policies that maybe come along with this that we need to also take a look at and make sure that they're still relevant.
Yep.
So
Agreed.
if I can, we did review the class sizes for middle school, and I believe 27 is max, correct, Tim?
Yeah, that's really I think the preferred size is, I forget the exact verbiage, but it's
25, I believe.
Yeah, but then the break is,
25.
Yep, that's right. That's correct. So I do think that Liz's point, Susie's point, I thought Ken made I think you're on the right track, and this is just my opinion, but I think that from a teacher perspective, right, it's the value add, those numbers, even though they don't sound like a big deal, when you talk about 23 versus 27, you're, in your brain math, it's only 4 more kids. But from a teaching perspective, class space with the amount of hands-on instruction, and it is a bit of a difference when you can go from, say 22 or 23 to 26, 27. It has a big impact.
And just one other comment, and then Kathleen, I apologize, I saw your hand up. The other piece that I would ask this board to consider is waiting to make decisions on everything that Liz brought up, Ken, I agree with. But I do think enrollment this year is going to be really interesting. We've had a lot of people move in and a lot of people move out, right? It goes both ways. If someone's buying a house, that means someone sold one. And whether or not that's young families or seasoned families where their children have transitioned out, that data in November, I think, will be really interesting. And of all the years that we should be looking at enrollment studies, I think this is one of the years, and perhaps that will give us more insight on, the future. But I do think that that's going to be a key piece of data and next steps. I apologize, Kathleen.
Oh, don't apologize, because I agree with you on that, because right now things are up in the air. We don't know who's
Yep.
coming back.
Exactly.
From what I'm reading in the paper, there's communities being built within our town where they falling and people are moving out. So I agree with that. But I also agree with what both Ken and Liz said, is that in the culture of our town with 6 elementary schools, we really need, and although we love, and we do love the community feel of each of our elementary schools, but they can't hamstring us. And we need to have a culture of where they're looked at systematically in the culture. And I would never do anything so drastic coming out of this crisis that we're coming out of. And let's live through it, but let's talk about.
Oops.
Kathleen, we lost you a little bit.
Oh, I was wondering if that was me.
Yeah, I thought it's usually me. So
Is she back?
She's unmute, Kathleen, I think.
I'm back. Sorry, I
Oh.
just went out and I'm back.
I just had an additional comment to follow up on something that Dr. Da Silva said, and I think it makes sense to start just logically, just from what I've been hearing in this conversation and the little bit that I've heard outside of this meeting, is that it makes sense to start at the elementary level. I mean, I think that's where, I mean, we're talking feeder patterns, and it's not just so that's where it begins, and I think that's where it makes the most sense to start with. So I think we need to that needs to be part of the conversation, definitely. And I mean, and it goes and it ties in with what we're talking about with any potential redistricting and anything that comes down to that. But I think that makes the most sense. Knowing what our target is, we have 2 elementary or 2 middle schools. That's our target. What's the best way to get there to achieve what we want to achieve at our middle schools?
And the only word of caution I'd say with any of this is that, and I appreciate, Tim, what you said about the class size, and 23 is very different than 26 and 27. And, as a teacher, I agree. Although that we also know that can change year to year. And it's hard to have that moving target of saying, let's try to keep them all at blank, because it is a moving target. And that's not limited. That's not Ridgefield. That's in any community. You just, you can make a shift, and you can have an influx of kids, and you have triplets, and all of a sudden things have changed. And so I would just caution us on, again, that fair isn't always equal, and equal doesn't, it changes. And in a child's experience in 13 years here in our community, we want them to have a wonderful experience, of course. And we don't want class sizes that are significantly high each year, but they're going to have class sizes that are sometimes lower and sometimes higher. There's going to be that grade level bubble that we're going to notice right from kindergarten, right? That's going to travel through, that's just going to end up with that higher class size.
Yep.
And it's been there that way. And similarly on the small side, we've seen that happen too. And that's across every community. And I think we have to be careful in trying to solve, whack-a-mole these moments in time, because ultimately I think that's probably what happened 5 years ago. And not to diminish any of the work or the challenges that any administration or board may have had, however long that was in 2016. But ultimately we solved for one thing and then didn't solve for other things that happened in the future years that obviously this administration and the Board of Ed is trying to figure out now. And it may be just that we're going to look at our data in November. And like you said, Ken, we have a practice that means that we review it every couple of years. And every couple of years, that may mean that some families have to shift, and we have to figure out what that's going to look like, so that families can come, because people may not like something that's coming, but if they know what's coming or what to expect, it feels very different. This is what, and they can set their family up for that. They can set their kids up for that, because they know that that's part of what happens here. And it's all good, because eventually you land upon one school and it's called Richfield High.
Yep.
Good. Are there any other comments from the committee or questions?
Not here.
Okay, anything else from the administration?
I guess the only thing I'd share is, in terms of next steps, we'll certainly put it on our agenda, and I'll share with Jonathan to have this be a part of the conversation at minimum after, well, we're going to review the enrollment obviously every month as we begin school, but certainly in November, I think we'll have a real good eye into the future. And then I would suggest that right after November, as a strategic planning work continues, that this be something that we either keep our eye on or create some kind of structure or policy to systematically do that.
And I think that I think some of those, again, we're talking, so that would be a December, so that's quite a few months from now. But I think we can start having the conversation about what would a plan, a systematic plan of redistricting look like. Not the specifics, but okay, it would this what are the considerations that have to be taken into account? And I think it's a high enough level that I think we can have those conversations, sort of prior to that, so that
Yeah.
we're still moving forward, at least on the big picture perspective.
Yeah, framework and decision criteria of when it gets triggered, right?
Exactly.
These are the triggers for a redistricting conversation versus just an arbitrary, it's been 3 years, let's look at it. Maybe there are some key changes in the demographics of the town that we could say, it's an overall increase of X% across the, middle schools or across the elementary schools, or, a significantly large population of, housing has been built or whatever. I think there are some things we could come up with that could create triggers that make it very transparent.
Exactly.
I love just from a principal standpoint, I love that. I think it's really helpful, because then, you're looking forward and you're not planning at the last minute or pulling the rug out from somebody and telling them at the last minute that we've got to redistrict. I think it's really smart and prudent to approach it from the way that you're thinking through it right now.
Yeah, and not just for families, but for staff, right? So that staff has an understanding of the process and how things are working, so that they feel comfortable in that process too.
Good.
Okay, well, we are at right to the minute. So see, short agendas don't necessarily mean short meetings. I think we learned that tonight for sure. All
It was
right.
good though.
It was really good. It was and productive, I felt. All right, so if there are no more questions or comments, I would like to go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Do I have a motion? Kathleen, second. Margaret, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Liz, aye, and that's unanimous. And thank you all very much. Everyone stay safe.